All right, so you're taking us on quite a journey today with this comparison. The Falkland Islands, or as they're known in Argentina, Islas Malvinas, and the Chagos Archipelago. Two island groups, worlds apart it seems, but both kind of tangled up in these disputes with the UK. So what got you thinking about these two places in particular?
Well, I think it's fascinating that you've sort of instinctively honed in on a pattern
Mm.
that often flies under the radar. We're
Hmm.
talking about the South Atlantic versus the middle of the Indian Ocean.
Hmm.
I mean, geographically, you couldn't get much further apart.
Right.
Yet, both of these cases bring up these really complex issues of colonialism and the fight for self-determination, which, as you can imagine, gets to the very heart of what it means for a nation to forge its own identity.
Right. So geographically and even historically, we're dealing with two very different situations, but there is this common thread of British involvement, and I'm guessing that's not a coincidence.
You hit the nail on the head.
Mhm.
Even a quick glance at the history of these islands reveals a bit of a pattern of a powerful nation holding on tight to territories that just happen to be in very strategic locations.
Yeah. Convenient indeed. So let's dive into the specifics here, starting with the Falklands Malvinas. The source material mentions this British occupation dating back to 1833 and Argentina's ongoing claim to the islands. But what does that actually mean for people on the ground today?
Well, imagine that weight of history on your shoulders.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the reality for many in Latin America when it comes to the Falklands Malvinas issue. It's become a symbol of this larger struggle against colonialism, a wound that hasn't quite healed, if you will. It's more than just a territorial dispute. It's deeply woven into their national identity.
It sounds like there's a very real emotional connection to this land, this sense of historical injustice. And then we have the Chagos Archipelago. What I've read about the situation is honestly heartbreaking.
Yeah, the Chagos situation really adds another layer of complexity to this whole idea of colonial legacies. Picture this 1968 Mauritius, where the Chagos Archipelago as a part of finally gains independence. But here's the catch, right? As they're celebrating this newfound freedom, the Chagos Islands are split off.
Wait, so they weren't even given a chance to object or?
Not really, no. It was a strategic maneuver, plain and simple. The UK and the US, in the thick of Cold War anxieties, saw these islands as the perfect spot for a military base. And to make way for this base, the entire Chagosan population was forcibly removed from their homes.
That's just wow. I mean, to be so close to claiming your rightful independence only to have your homeland turned into a pawn in somebody else's game, it's hard to even fathom.
And that's precisely why your instinct to compare these two cases is so spot on. Because even though they're separated by vast distances and distinct histories, they expose this pattern of a powerful nation exerting control over strategically valuable territory. In the case of the Chagos Archipelago, it was shrouded in Cold War secrecy. But with the Falklands Malvinas, the justification takes a slightly different turn, doesn't it?
Right, and I'm already sensing there's a lot to unpack there, especially given that our source material presents a distinctly Argentinian perspective.
Exactly. And that's crucial to keep in mind as we kind of dive deeper here. Because while the UK's stance centers on protecting the interests of British settlers who've made the islands their home, we need to acknowledge that this perspective, understandably, doesn't sit well with many Argentinians. They see it as a continuation of colonial-era power dynamics.
It's like you said earlier, these are deeply emotional, deeply personal issues tied to national identity. So how has the international community responded to these situations? Have there been any attempts to find some kind of resolution, or are we talking complete stalemates here?
Well, the path to justice is rarely straightforward, as you'll see. There have been some interesting developments, but whether they represent true progress is debatable. Let's start with the Chagos Archipelago.
Hmm.
In 2019, the International Court of Justice actually ruled in favor of Mauritius and demanded that the UK return the islands. It seemed like a victory, a chance for the Chagosian people to finally reclaim their birthright.
So a happy ending then.
Not quite. There was an agreement for the UK to return sovereignty, yes. But here's the catch. They're holding on to their military presence in Diego Garcia.
Oh, wow. So it's a partial victory at best. And I imagine that doesn't sit well with a lot of people.
You're exactly right. It raises the question, what does true justice really look like?
Mm.
Is it simply a matter of legal technicalities? Or is it about addressing the deeper wounds of the past, the human cost of these geopolitical maneuvers?
It makes you wonder if the UK is applying a double standard here. They seem willing to bend to international pressure in the case of the Chagos Archipelago, but when it comes to the Falklands Malvinas, radio silence.
It's a question many are asking, especially in Argentina. And our source material really digs into that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They point to the current Argentinian government accusing them of being too accommodating to British interests, particularly when it comes to fishing rights and those flights to Falklands Malvinas.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. They call out President Milei, specifically alleging that his policies essentially appease colonialism by not taking a harder stance against British control. But remember, this is one perspective, one voice in a much larger conversation.
It's fascinating how these echoes of history can reverberate so strongly in the present day. And you've highlighted just how significant those resources are, the fishing grounds, the military bases, and these power struggles. Makes you wonder about the economic implications tied up in all of this too, right? Who benefits financially from maintaining the status quo?
Absolutely. It's never as simple as just lines on a map, is it? The control of resources, like you said, those fishing grounds around the Falklands, Malvinas, the strategic positioning of Diego Garcia for the UK and the US, those are major economic and geopolitical playing cards.
It's like these islands become pawns in a much larger game. What about the human cost? We can't forget about the people caught in the middle of all of this. I mean, the forced removal of the Chagosian people is just one tragic example. But what about those who are living in the Falklands, Malvinas right now?
It's an incredibly complex issue. We have to consider, those who call the Falklands, Malvinas home, regardless of how they got there or what the political climate is. They've built lives, families, a sense of community on those islands. It's their home, and those personal stories, their perspectives are crucial to understanding the bigger picture.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical chess match, but at the heart of it are real people with their own dreams, hopes, and fears for the future. And it all goes back to your point about identity and self-determination. These island disputes are about so much more than just land or resources. They're about people's right to define their own future, which is something that resonates far beyond just these two cases, right?
Precisely. You've hit on a fundamental question of our time. If international law, even with rulings like the one we saw in favor of Mauritius, struggles to truly rectify historical wrongs, what does that say about the future of self-determination, especially for those still grappling with the legacies of colonialism?
It's a sobering thought. It feels like there's this tension between this desire for these clear-cut resolutions and the very messy realities of history. It's almost like, in a way, these cases expose the limitations of the very systems that were designed to address these global issues.
And they force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power dynamics in the 21st century. Even with the formal end of colonial empires, are we seeing new forms of colonialism emerge? A neo-colonialism where economic interests and strategic positioning supersede the rights of less powerful nations or peoples.
It's a question worth grappling with. What you've highlighted here is that even though the Chagos archipelago and the Falklands Malvinas are thousands of miles apart, they're connected by these much larger, more intricate threads of history power and this quest for self-determination.
And your astute observation at the beginning that there was something compelling about comparing these two island groups, that instinct was spot on. It's in those echoes, the recurring patterns, that we often find the most profound insights.
It's like holding up a mirror to history and seeing reflections of the same struggles, the same questions staring back at us. It makes you wonder, where do we go from here? What does it mean to strive for justice and equity in a world that's still grappling with the ghosts of its past? And more importantly, what can we do as individuals who are learning about these situations to create a more just and equitable future?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they? And while there are no easy answers, I think the first step is exactly what you're doing, engaging in thoughtful, informed conversations. Knowledge is power. And by shining a light on these complex situations, by understanding the nuances and acknowledging the human stories at the heart of them, we take a step towards progress.
I love that knowledge as a catalyst for change. So in a way, these deep dives, they're not just about uncovering information, they're about sparking a sense of responsibility.
Absolutely. It's about fostering a sense of global citizenship, recognizing that even though we might be continents away, we're all interconnected. And the more we understand these complex issues, the better equipped we are to ask difficult questions, challenge the status quo, and advocate for a more just and equitable world.
Which brings us back to the heart of your initial request to understand why these two seemingly disparate island groups, the Falklands Malvinas and the Chagos archipelago, are worth comparing. And I think we've discovered that it's not just about the similarities on the surface, but about the deeper, often uncomfortable truths they reveal about power, legacy, and this ongoing struggle for self-determination.
You've articulated that beautifully. And perhaps the most crucial takeaway here is that these aren't just abstract geopolitical events. They're stories about real people whose lives, cultures, and identities are intricately connected to these islands.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't confined to textbooks. It's alive, it's evolving, and it's shaping the world we live in today. And that, I believe, is something worth talking about. And that's what makes these deep dives so compelling for me. It's not always about having all the answers. It's about recognizing that the quest for knowledge and understanding is a continuous journey.
Beautifully put.
Hmm.
And I think what we've uncovered in this particular journey is that even these seemingly small islands, thousands of miles apart, can act like seismic sensors, revealing these much larger tectonic shifts in global power dynamics.
It's like those ripples you mentioned earlier, the ones that start small but expand outwards, impacting everything in their path.
Exactly. Recognizing those ripples, understanding those connections, that's where we as individuals can start to make a difference.
So where do we even begin? You've given us so much to unpack here. What are some tangible steps we can take to become more engaged global citizens?
Well, you've already taken the most important one, choosing to learn about these complex issues.
Hmm.
Knowledge is the seed of awareness, and awareness is often the catalyst for action.
So it's about going beyond just the headlines, right? Digging deeper, asking those uncomfortable questions.
You got it. And then taking that knowledge and turning it into something tangible, whether it's supporting organizations, working on these issues, engaging in a respectful dialogue with others, or simply staying informed and amplifying the voices of those who are directly impacted.
It's about recognizing that even though these situations might feel worlds away, our actions, our choices, they do have an impact on the global stage.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And every conversation we have, every action we take, it all contributes to a greater understanding and hopefully a more just and equitable future.
This has been such an insightful deep dive you've given me, and I'm sure our listeners a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on.
Well, the credit goes to you for asking such insightful questions.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure exploring these crucial issues with you.
The pleasure was all ours. Thank you for joining us on this journey today.
Until next time.